My son called me selfish in front of our entire family because I booked my first vacation in nearly 50 years. The room went silent as Brandon stared at me across the dinner table and said, "Mom, that money should be helping your family, not paying for some trip to Europe." I could barely breathe. For years, I had emptied my savings whenever he needed help. Credit cards, bills, business problems, emergencies. I never kept score. But as everyone watched me sit there in shock, one painful question echoed through my mind. How could the son I had sacrificed everything for accuse me of being selfish? Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt taken for granted by someone you loved? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying stories like this, please like and subscribe. I always enjoy reading where you're watching from, so tell me your city, state, and the current time where you are right now. 5 years before my son called me selfish, I buried my husband. Even now, writing those words hurts. Robert Pierce and I had been married for 43 years. We weren't wealthy. We never owned a vacation home. We never drove luxury cars. We were the kind of people who clipped coupons, packed lunches, and spent Saturday mornings comparing grocery store prices. But we had something better than wealth. We had stability. Robert worked as a maintenance supervisor for the Columbus School District. I spent nearly 30 years as an accountant for the same district. We raised our only child, Brandon, in a modest brick house on a quiet street in Ohio. We taught him the same values we lived by: work hard, pay your bills, take responsibility, help family when they need it. When Robert died from a sudden heart attack at 71, my world shattered. One morning, he was sitting across from me drinking coffee and complaining about the weather. That evening, he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. For months, I wandered through the house like a ghost. His reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter. His favorite chair remained untouched in the living room. Every room reminded me of him. Every corner carried a memory. The only thing that kept me moving forward was my family, especially Brandon. At the time, he was 37 years old, married to Heather, and raising their daughter Madison. I remember thinking that perhaps helping them would give me purpose again. Maybe that was my first mistake. About 6 months after Robert's funeral, Brandon called me one evening. His voice sounded stressed. "Mom, can we talk?" My heart immediately raced. Whenever a parent hears those words, they assume something is wrong. "Of course," I said. He sighed heavily. "I've gotten into some trouble with credit card debt." I felt my stomach tighten. "How much trouble?" There was a pause. Then he told me. The amount shocked me. Apparently, a series of unexpected expenses had piled up. Business had slowed down. Interest rates had climbed. He was struggling to keep up. "I hate asking you this," he said. That sentence should have been a warning. Looking back, it always started that way. "I hate asking you this. I never wanted to burden you. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency." At the time, though, I believed every word. He was my son. Why wouldn't I? "How much do you need?" I asked. When I transferred the money the next day, Brandon sounded overwhelmed with gratitude. "Mom, thank you. Seriously, I don't know what I'd do without you." Hearing that made me feel useful, needed, important. After losing Robert, those feelings mattered more than I realized. A few days later, Heather called. She thanked me repeatedly. "You saved us," she said. "You have no idea how much this means." I remember hanging up and smiling. Helping my family felt right. It felt like exactly what Robert would have wanted. For a while, everything seemed fine. Life settled into a routine. I spent my mornings gardening. I volunteered twice a week at the local library. I attended church on Sundays. I had dinner with Patricia Walker every Thursday evening. Patricia had been my closest friend for more than 30 years. She was the kind of friend who could tell what I was feeling before I said a word. One night over dinner, I mentioned helping Brandon. Patricia raised an eyebrow. How much did you give him? When I told her, she nearly choked on her coffee. Gloria, that's not a small amount. He needed help. So did a lot of people. I frowned. He's my son. Patricia nodded slowly. I know. There was a long pause. Then she asked a question I didn't like. Did he ask a bank first? I immediately became defensive. He was embarrassed. Maybe. I crossed my arms. Why are you acting like helping my son is a bad thing? Patricia sighed. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying you need to protect yourself too. I laughed. Protect myself from Brandon. The idea seemed ridiculous. My son wasn't a threat. He wasn't taking advantage of me. He was simply going through a difficult period. At least that's what I believed. The truth is, I wanted to believe it. There's a difference. When you're a mother, sometimes your heart hears what it wants to hear. The months passed. Then one afternoon, Brandon called again. His business truck needed major repairs. The estimate was expensive. Without the truck, he couldn't work. Without work, he couldn't support his family. At least that was the story. So I helped. Again. The amount wasn't as large as before. Still, it came from the savings Robert and I had spent decades building. When I transferred the money, I told myself it was temporary. Just until Brandon got back on his feet. Just until things improved. Just until life became easier. But life never seemed to become easier for him. There was always another problem waiting around the corner. Another crisis. Another emergency. Another reason he needed help. Meanwhile, I continued living carefully. My pension wasn't enormous. It covered my bills and allowed me a comfortable life. But I wasn't rich. Every dollar mattered. Sometimes I would sit at my kitchen table balancing my budget and wonder how Robert would feel about all of this. Then I would picture Brandon as a little boy. I would remember his first day of kindergarten, his baseball games, the nights I sat beside his bed when he was sick. Those memories always softened me. Because no matter how old your child becomes, part of you still sees the little kid they once were. That was especially true for me after Robert died. Brandon wasn't just my son anymore. In some ways, he had become my connection to the family Robert and I built together. And protecting that connection felt more important than protecting my bank account. At the time, I thought that made me a loving mother. I had no idea that the small favors I kept saying yes to were quietly becoming a pattern that would eventually cost me far more than money. The second time Brandon asked for money, I barely hesitated. The third time, I didn't hesitate at all. That's how gradually it happened. No single request seemed outrageous by itself. No single phone call made me think I was being used. Each problem sounded reasonable. Each emergency felt temporary. But when I look back now, I can see the pattern clearly. At the time, I couldn't. About a year after I helped Brandon pay off his credit card debt, he called me on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was folding laundry when my phone rang. The moment I saw his name, I smiled. I always smiled when my son called. Hi, sweetheart. His voice sounded tense. Mom, do you have a minute? Immediately, my maternal instincts kicked in. What's wrong? My truck broke down. I closed my eyes. Not again. The truck was essential to his business. Without it, he couldn't visit clients or transport equipment. At least that's what he told me. The repair shop says it's serious, he said. How serious? He told me the amount. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't a small repair. Still, I couldn't imagine refusing. If I don't fix it, I could lose several contracts. The fear in his voice sounded genuine, and maybe it was. Looking back, that's what made everything so difficult. I don't think Brandon started out trying to manipulate me. I think he simply discovered that asking me for help was easier than solving problems himself. There's a difference. At first, the next morning, I transferred the money. He thanked me repeatedly. Heather texted me a long message about how grateful they were. I felt relieved, useful again. A few months later, another crisis arrived. This time, it was medical bills. Apparently, Heather needed a procedure that insurance wouldn't fully cover. Brandon sounded exhausted when he called. "Mom, I hate doing this." There was that sentence again. I hate doing this. By then it had become almost a script. The same apologetic tone, the same hesitation, the same promise that it would be the last time. I wanted to believe him. So I helped, again. The amount was smaller than before, but it still came from my savings. When I mentioned it to Patricia over dinner, she set down her fork and stared at me. That's 3 times in less than 2 years. I shrugged. Families help each other. Families do help each other. She leaned forward. But healthy families don't have the same emergency every few months. I didn't like hearing that, not because she was wrong, because part of me feared she might be right. I changed the subject. Patricia let it go. But I could tell she was worried. The requests continued. School expenses for Madison, a temporary business slowdown, unexpected home repairs, a tax issue, a plumbing disaster. The reasons changed. The outcome never did. Every few months, Brandon needed money. Every few months, I found myself writing another check. What made it harder was Madison. My granddaughter was the brightest light in my life. She was kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. Whenever I visited, she would sit beside me and tell me about school books and her dreams. She wanted to become an architect one day. Listening to her talk always reminded me of Brandon before adulthood complicated everything. Whenever Brandon asked for help, I often pictured Madison. I told myself I wasn't helping him. I was helping her. That justification made it easier. One Saturday afternoon, I attended Madison's soccer game. Afterward, we all went out for lunch. As we sat around the table, I noticed something. Brandon and Heather were discussing plans for an expensive concert they wanted to attend. They were laughing, talking excitedly, looking completely carefree. For a brief moment, something felt strange. A few weeks earlier, they had supposedly been struggling to pay bills. Now they were discussing weekend trips and entertainment packages. The thought crossed my mind only briefly. Then I pushed it away. Nobody deserves to be judged for enjoying life, especially family. That was always my weakness. Whenever evidence appeared, I found a way to explain it. I wanted to see the best in people, especially my son. The following year brought more requests. By then, the conversations had become routine. Brandon no longer sounded embarrassed. That change happened so gradually, I almost missed it. The hesitation disappeared. The apologies became shorter. The requests became more direct. "Mom, we're a little short this month." "Mom, can you help us out?" "Mom, we'll pay you back after tax season." The repayment never came, not once. Occasionally I would think about it. Then I would feel guilty for even considering it. What kind of mother keeps score? That's what I told myself. One evening while reviewing my finances, I noticed something unsettling. The balance in my savings account had dropped much lower than I expected. I stared at the screen. For the first time, I added up several of the larger amounts I had given Brandon over the years. The total surprised me. Not because it was catastrophic, because it was significant, very significant, enough to make me uncomfortable, enough to make me wonder whether Robert would approve. I closed the laptop. I didn't want to think about it. The next day, Brandon called again. His business was facing another slowdown. Clients were delaying payments. Cash flow was tight. Could I help? Just one more time? Always one more time. I remember standing in my kitchen staring out the window while he talked. The maple tree Robert had planted 20 years earlier swayed gently in the wind. For some reason, I suddenly felt tired. Not angry, not suspicious. Just tired. Tired of emergencies. Tired of worry. tired of feeling responsible for problems that weren't mine. But then Brandon mentioned Madison. He said he was worried about providing for her. That was enough. My resolve disappeared immediately. Within 48 hours, I had sent another check. A week later, Patricia came over for coffee. As we sat at the kitchen table, she studied me carefully. "You look exhausted." I forced a smile. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." I looked away. Patricia reached across the table and touched my hand. "Gloria, when was the last time you did something for yourself?" I laughed softly. "I don't know." "I'm serious." I thought about it. The answer embarrassed me. I genuinely couldn't remember. Years, maybe decades. My life had always revolved around somebody else. First my parents, then Robert, then Brandon, then Madison. There was always someone who needed me, someone who came first. Patricia shook her head. "One day you're going to wake up and realize you've spent your entire life taking care of everyone except Gloria Pierce." I tried to laugh it off, but her words stayed with me. Long after she left, long after the coffee cups were washed, long after the house grew quiet. Because deep down, I was beginning to notice something I hadn't wanted to see before. The requests for money weren't slowing down. They were becoming normal. And when something unhealthy starts feeling normal, that's often when the real trouble begins. Patricia's question haunted me for weeks. "When was the last time you did something for yourself?" At first, I tried not to think about it. I kept busy. I tended my garden. I volunteered at the library. I attended church. I visited Madison. I answered Brandon's phone calls. Life continued exactly as it always had. But every so often, usually late at night, when the house was quiet, Patricia's words would return. What had I done for myself? The honest answer was surprisingly painful. Almost nothing. Not because I didn't have opportunities, because I never allowed myself to take them. Throughout my life, there was always a reason to postpone my own happiness. When I was young, I helped my parents. When I got married, Robert, and I focused on building a stable life. When Brandon was born, every spare dollar went toward raising him. When money became available, there was always a roof that needed repairs, a tuition payment, a car problem, or some other family responsibility. I never complained. That was simply how life worked. At least, that's what I believed. One Thursday afternoon, Patricia and I were having lunch at a small cafe near downtown Columbus. She was telling me about a recent trip she'd taken with a senior travel group. As she described walking through old European streets and meeting people from around the world, I found myself listening more closely than usual. "You should come next time," she said casually. I laughed. "Me, absolutely not." "Why not?" "I've never traveled internationally." "So? I wouldn't know what I'm doing." Patricia rolled her eyes. "Neither did I the first time." I smiled nervously. The truth was, the idea frightened me. But it also excited me. And that combination was unfamiliar. Very unfamiliar. Patricia leaned forward. "Gloria, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "If Robert were sitting here right now, do you honestly think he'd want you spending the rest of your life sitting alone in that house?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I looked down at my coffee, because I already knew the answer. Robert would hate it. My husband had always encouraged me to dream bigger than I allowed myself to. I was the cautious one. He was the adventurous one. I suddenly remembered a conversation we'd had years earlier. It was sometime around our 40th wedding anniversary. We had been watching a travel documentary about France. The Eiffel Tower filled the television screen. Paris looked magical. I remember Robert wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "One day," he said, "I'm taking you there." I laughed. "With what money?" "We'll figure it out." "Sure we will." "I'm serious." His eyes sparkled. "One day you'll stand underneath that tower." I smiled at the memory. Then my smile faded. Because that day never came. Life got busy, work got demanding, responsibilities piled up. Then suddenly Robert was gone. The dream disappeared with him. Or so I thought. That evening, after returning home, I found myself searching online for European travel tours. At first, it was just curiosity, nothing serious. I browsed photos of Paris, Rome, Venice, London, beautiful places I'd only seen in movies. The more I looked, the more something stirred inside me. A feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about obligations. I wasn't thinking about bills. I wasn't thinking about Brandon's problems. I was thinking about something I wanted. The realization felt strange, almost selfish. A few days later, Patricia called. "Did you look at those tours?" I hesitated. "Maybe." She laughed. "I knew it. I was just curious." "Of course." The following week, she convinced me to attend a presentation hosted by a travel company specializing in trips for older adults. I almost canceled 3 times, but somehow I ended up there. The room was filled with retirees, widows, couples, friends, people my age who were planning adventures instead of waiting for life to happen. As I listened to the presentation, my excitement grew, especially when they discussed Paris. I could almost hear Robert's voice. "One day you'll stand underneath that tower." Driving home that evening, I cried, not because I was sad, because I realized how much of myself I had forgotten. Somewhere along the way, Gloria Pierce had disappeared. She had become a mother, a wife, a helper, a provider, a problem solver. Everything except herself. That realization changed something. Not overnight. But it started a process. For the first time, I began setting aside money specifically for myself. The idea felt almost rebellious. Every month, I transferred a small amount into a separate savings account. Nothing dramatic, nothing irresponsible. Just enough to slowly build a travel fund. I didn't tell Brandon. I didn't tell Heather. The only person who knew was Patricia. Even then, I felt guilty. One afternoon, while making the transfer online, I caught myself wondering whether Brandon might need that money someday. The thought came automatically, as naturally as breathing. Then I stopped. Why was my first instinct always to give away something before I even had it? Why did everyone else's future matter more than mine? For once, I left the money exactly where it was. Month after month, the account grew. Slowly, steadily, each deposit felt symbolic, like I was reclaiming a tiny piece of myself. Meanwhile, Brandon's requests continued. Not constantly, but often enough. Whenever he called, I still helped when I could. Yet something had changed inside me. Patricia's words had planted a seed, a dangerous seed. The idea that maybe my life still belonged to me. One afternoon, nearly a year after opening the account, I checked the balance. I stared at the number. Then I looked at several travel packages online. For the first time, the dream seemed realistic. Not someday, not eventually, soon. My hands trembled slightly as I reviewed the itineraries. Paris, Rome, Venice. 3 cities Robert had always wanted us to see together. I imagined walking through ancient streets, visiting museums, sitting in outdoor cafes, watching sunsets over places I'd only seen in photographs. The excitement was overwhelming. But so was the fear. Because deep down, I already knew something. The moment Brandon found out about this trip, he wouldn't see it the way I did. He wouldn't see decades of sacrifice. He wouldn't see a widow finally fulfilling a lifelong dream. He would see money. Money that wasn't being spent on him. At the time, I tried to ignore that feeling. I convinced myself I was being unfair. I convinced myself Brandon would be happy for me. Supportive, even. After all, what son wouldn't want his mother to enjoy her retirement Looking back now, I realize part of me already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. Still, that night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a promise to myself. A promise I had never made before. One day soon, I was going to take that trip. Not for Brandon, not for anyone else. For me, and for the dream Robert never got the chance to fulfill. I had no idea that decision would eventually expose the truth about my family. For almost a year, my travel fund remained a secret. Not because I was trying to deceive anyone, because I wanted something that belonged entirely to me. That may sound strange coming from a 68-year-old woman, but after a lifetime of putting everyone else first, having a private dream felt surprisingly precious. Every month, I added a little more money to the account. Some months it was a few $100s. Other months it was less. The amount didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented: freedom, hope, a promise to myself. Eventually, the balance reached the point where I could seriously consider booking the trip. I remember the exact day. It was a Wednesday morning in early spring. The sun was shining through my kitchen window as I sat at the table with my laptop open. My heart pounded as I reviewed the itinerary one final time. 10 days, Paris, Rome, Venice, everything Robert and I had once dreamed about. I stared at the screen for several minutes. Then I clicked the button. Book now. For a moment, I simply sat there, staring, breathing, waiting. When the confirmation email arrived, tears filled my eyes. I had done it. After decades of postponing my own happiness, I had finally chosen myself. I immediately called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. "Did you do it?" I laughed through my tears. "How did you know?" "Because you sound different." "I booked it." Patricia screamed so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Then we both started laughing. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about something. Not worried, not responsible, excited. Over the next few weeks, I began preparing for the trip. I bought a new suitcase, nothing fancy, just practical. I renewed my passport. I started reading travel guides. At night, I would sit in my living room, imagining myself walking beneath the Eiffel Tower. Every time I thought about it, I smiled. That smile disappeared 3 weeks later. It happened completely by accident. Heather stopped by one afternoon to drop off a birthday invitation for Madison. We sat in the kitchen drinking iced tea and chatting. The visit seemed perfectly normal. Then she noticed a brochure on the counter. I had forgotten to put it away. Her eyes immediately landed on the photograph of Paris. "Oh." She picked it up. "What's this?" I smiled. "My vacation." Her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "Vacation?" I nodded. "I finally booked that Europe trip I've always wanted." For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she forced a smile. "Wow." Something about her tone felt strange, but I ignored it. I spent the next few minutes excitedly describing the itinerary. Paris, Rome, Venice. She listened politely, yet her enthusiasm seemed oddly limited. When she left, I brushed off the uncomfortable feeling. The next morning, Brandon called. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. "Mom." His tone was cold, far colder than usual. "What's going on?" "You booked a trip to Europe." My stomach tightened. Heather had told him. "Yes." There was a long silence. Then he laughed. Not a happy laugh, a disbelieving one. "You spent that much money." I blinked. "Brandon, it's my retirement." "That's not the point." I sat down slowly. The conversation was already heading somewhere unpleasant. "What is the point?" His voice became sharper. "The point is that our family is struggling." I frowned. I didn't realize things were that bad. "They could get bad." I stared at the phone. Could get bad? That wasn't exactly an emergency. He continued. Madison will be applying to colleges soon? I know. You know how expensive that's going to be. I felt confusion spreading through me. Brandon, what does that have to do with my vacation? The silence that followed felt heavy. Then he said something I never expected. Honestly, Mom, I think it's selfish. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Excuse me? Spending all that money on yourself. The words hit me like a slap. My own son, calling me selfish. After everything, I struggled to find my voice. I worked my entire life. Nobody's saying you didn't. I saved for this. Meanwhile, your family could use help. I felt my chest tighten. Could use help. Not needed help. Not emergency help. Could use help. The distinction mattered, and for the first time I noticed it. The conversation continued growing more tense. Brandon listed expenses, future college costs, potential repairs, business concerns, hypothetical problems. Every example involved money that didn't yet need to be spent, yet somehow he was treating my vacation as if I had stolen something from him. Finally, I interrupted. Brandon. What? Do you hear yourself? He sighed heavily. Mom, I'm just being honest. No. My voice shook. You're being unfair. Another silence. Then came the sentence that haunted me for days. You've changed. I almost laughed. Changed? Because I wanted to take one vacation? Because I wasn't immediately handing over money? The accusation felt absurd, yet somehow it hurt. Perhaps because part of me feared it contained a grain of truth. I had changed. Not in the way Brandon meant. But I had changed. For the first time, I was beginning to value my own happiness. And apparently, that made some people uncomfortable. The call ended badly. Neither of us apologized. Neither of us backed down. Afterward, I sat alone in my kitchen staring at the wall. The excitement I had felt for weeks was gone, replaced by sadness, confusion, and guilt. So much guilt. That evening, Patricia came over. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I told her everything. Every word. Every accusation. Every painful moment. When I finished, she looked furious. Let me get this straight. I nodded. Your son called you selfish because you're taking your first major vacation at 68 years old. I stared into my coffee. It sounds ridiculous when you say it like that. Because it is ridiculous. I didn't answer. Patricia leaned forward. Gloria, how many times have you helped him financially? I shrugged. I don't know. More than 10? Probably. More than 20. I hesitated. Maybe? Her eyes widened. Exactly. The room fell silent. Deep down, I knew she was right, but accepting that truth felt painful. Because if Patricia was right, then my son's reaction wasn't about concern. It wasn't about family. It wasn't about Madison. It was about something else entirely. And for the first time, I found myself wondering a question I had spent years avoiding. What if Brandon had stopped seeing my money as mine? What if he already considered it his? I tried to dismiss the thought, but once it appeared, I couldn't make it disappear. And over the following weeks, that question would lead me toward a truth far more disturbing than I was prepared to face. After Brandon called me selfish, I expected things to cool down. I thought a few days would pass, emotions would settle, and we'd return to normal. I was wrong. The pressure only intensified. For the next several weeks, it felt as though every conversation somehow circled back to money. Not directly at first. That was what made it so exhausting. The comments were subtle, carefully placed, designed to make me feel guilty without sounding openly accusatory. One Sunday afternoon, I drove to Brandon's house for a family barbecue. The weather was beautiful. Children played in neighboring yards. The smell of grilled hamburgers filled the air. From the outside, Everything appeared perfectly normal. But underneath, something had changed. I felt it the moment I walked through the door. Heather greeted me warmly enough. Madison hugged me as always. Brandon smiled, yet the atmosphere felt different, almost strained, as though everyone was avoiding a topic they desperately wanted to discuss. It didn't take long. While we were eating lunch in the backyard, Heather casually mentioned college tuition. Madison was beginning to explore universities. Applications would start soon. Costs were increasing every year. She sighed dramatically. I honestly don't know how families manage these days. I took a sip of iced tea. I imagine it's difficult. It really is. Another sigh. Especially when you don't have wealthy relatives. The comment landed exactly where she intended. I looked up. Heather offered a small smile, as if nothing unusual had been said. I felt my stomach tighten. For years, I would have immediately offered reassurance. Maybe even financial help. This time, I remained silent. A few minutes later, Brandon joined in. He talked about rising business expenses, economic uncertainty, inflation, insurance costs. Every topic seemed carefully chosen. Every sentence felt aimed at the same target: me. By the time I drove home that evening, I felt emotionally drained. The conversation hadn't contained a single direct request for money. Yet somehow, I felt as though I had spent 3 hours defending my vacation. That pattern continued. Phone calls, family dinners, birthday gatherings. The message remained the same. Your family needs help. Your money could be useful. Your trip is unnecessary. Nobody said those exact words. They didn't need to. The implication hung in the air constantly. One evening, Brandon called. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Mom, can we talk?" The phrase no longer filled me with concern. Now it filled me with caution. "Sure," he hesitated. "I've been thinking about the trip." I closed my eyes. Here we go again. "What about it?" "I just think your priorities are changing." The accusation surprised me. "My priorities? You're focusing more on yourself lately." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. More on myself lately after nearly 70 years of putting everyone else first. The statement felt absurd. Yet somehow it still hurt. "Brandon," I said carefully, "I'm taking one vacation." "It's not just the vacation. What else is it?" He hesitated. Then he answered, "You seem different." There was that word again. Different. As if changing was somehow a crime. As if personal growth represented betrayal. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us felt satisfied. And with every discussion, the distance between us seemed to grow. The hardest part wasn't Brandon. It was the guilt. The constant guilt. Years of motherhood had conditioned me to place my family's needs above my own. Whenever I imagined walking through Paris, a voice inside my head immediately asked, "What if Brandon needs help?" Whenever I looked at travel photos, another voice whispered, "Shouldn't that money stay in the family?" I hated those thoughts. But they were real. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing travel documents. My excitement should have been growing. Instead, anxiety consumed me. For almost an hour, I stared at the papers without reading a single word. Eventually, I called Patricia. She answered immediately. "What's wrong?" "I don't know if I can do this." There was silence. Then, "Do what?" "The trip." I heard her exhale sharply. "Gloria, maybe Brandon's right." "No." "Maybe I should wait." "No." "Maybe." "Absolutely not." Her voice cut through my uncertainty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Patricia asked a question. One simple question. "When does it end?" I frowned. When does your obligation end?" I didn't understand. She continued. "You helped Brandon in his 20s. Yes. You helped him in his 30s. Yes. Now you're helping him in his 40s. I remained silent. Patricia's voice softened. Are you planning to keep doing this when you're 80? The question hit me hard, because I didn't have an answer. Deep down, I realized something frightening. There would always be another reason, another expense, another emergency, another justification. If I waited until everyone else's needs disappeared, I would never do anything for myself. Ever. A few days later, something happened that shook me even more. I was visiting Brandon's house on a Saturday afternoon. Madison was upstairs studying. Heather had gone shopping. Brandon was in the garage. I had arrived early and entered through the side door. As I walked through the house, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Brandon and Heather were talking. Neither realized I was already inside. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but then I heard my name. So I stopped, only for a moment. At least that was my intention. She's really going through with it, Heather said. Brandon sounded irritated. I know. That's a lot of money. Another pause, then Brandon laughed. A short, frustrated laugh. Imagine spending all that on a vacation, Heather agreed, especially when Madison's college is coming up. The conversation continued, nothing overtly cruel, nothing openly hostile. Yet something about it disturbed me. Not because they were discussing finances, because they were discussing my money as though it belonged to them. As though my decisions required their approval. As though they had already claimed ownership over resources that weren't theirs. I quietly backed away before they saw me. The rest of the visit felt uncomfortable. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. That evening, I sat alone in my living room. The house was silent. The same silence that had surrounded me after Robert died. Only now, it felt different. Heavier. More revealing. I found myself staring at an old photograph of our family. Robert, Brandon, me, all smiling, all happy. I wondered what Robert would think if he could see us now. Then another thought entered my mind. A painful one. For years, I had assumed my family valued me. But what if they mostly valued what I could provide? I immediately felt ashamed for thinking it. A mother shouldn't think that way about her child. Should she yet? The question refused to disappear. The more I examined our recent interactions, the more uncomfortable I became. The criticism had started the moment money stopped flowing in their direction. Not before, not during years of financial support, not while I was paying bills and solving problems. Only after I decided to spend something on myself. That realization was impossible to ignore. And then a few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. A small detail, one that seemed insignificant at first, but it would soon change everything I believed about Brandon's so-called financial struggles. The small detail appeared on a Tuesday morning. At first, it seemed completely insignificant. I was drinking coffee and scrolling through Facebook when a photograph caught my attention. It had been posted by one of Brandon's friends. The image showed several people standing beside a lake. Everyone was smiling, holding fishing rods, wearing expensive outdoor gear. I almost kept scrolling. Then I noticed Brandon. There he was in the center of the picture, grinning broadly. The caption read, "Perfect weekend getaway with great friends." I frowned. Weekend getaway? That seemed strange. Just 2 weeks earlier, Brandon had spent nearly an hour explaining how financially stressed he was. According to him, business was unstable. Expenses were overwhelming. The future looked uncertain. Yet there he was, enjoying what appeared to be a luxury fishing retreat. I clicked on the album. There were dozens of photographs. A rented cabin, a speedboat, restaurant dinners, outdoor activities. Nothing outrageous, but certainly not cheap. I sat back in my chair. A familiar feeling stirred inside me. Discomfort. Not because Brandon was having fun, because the image didn't match the story I'd been hearing for years. I tried to dismiss the thought. Everyone deserves a break. Everyone deserves enjoyment. That was true. Yet the contradiction lingered. Over the following days, I found myself noticing more things. things I had somehow overlooked before, or perhaps things I had chosen not to see. One afternoon, I stopped by Brandon's house to drop off a birthday card for Madison. As I pulled into the driveway, something immediately caught my attention. A vehicle I had never seen before. A dark blue SUV. Large, modern, expensive. I parked and stared at it for a moment. Maybe it belonged to a visitor. That seemed reasonable. But when Brandon opened the front door, he casually tossed a set of keys onto the kitchen counter. The same SUV keys. My eyes drifted toward them. Brandon noticed. "Oh," he smiled. "We upgraded." Upgraded. The word echoed in my mind. I forced a smile. "It's nice." It had a great financing package. I nodded politely. Yet something felt wrong. Very wrong. For years, I had listened to stories about financial hardship. Now there was a brand new SUV sitting in the driveway. Once again, I tried to explain it away. Perhaps they received a good deal. Perhaps the old vehicle became unreliable. Perhaps there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but the questions continued growing. Later that afternoon, I stepped inside the house and noticed several changes. New furniture, a large television, updated appliances. None of those items were outrageous on their own, yet together they painted a picture that looked very different from financial struggle. As Brandon spoke about work, my eyes wandered around the room. I couldn't stop comparing what I saw with what I had been told. The contradiction felt impossible to ignore. That evening I called Patricia. The moment she answered, she knew something was bothering me. "What happened?" I told her about the SUV, the fishing trip, the home upgrades, everything. Patricia listened quietly. When I finished, she asked a simple question. "Have you ever actually verified any of Brandon's financial emergencies?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" I mean exactly what I said." I remained silent. The truth was uncomfortable. No, I hadn't verified anything. Not once. Why would I? He was my son. That had always been enough. Patricia sighed. "Gloria, I'm not telling you he's lying. But you might want to start paying attention." After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room, thinking about our conversation. The more I reflected, the more memories resurfaced. Small things, tiny details, comments I had ignored, questions I had avoided asking. Over the years, Brandon's explanations had become less detailed, less convincing. Yet I had continued helping, not because the stories made sense, because I trusted him, perhaps too much. A few days later, another incident pushed me further. Madison had a school event. I attended, as I always did. Afterward, several parents gathered in the parking lot talking. One woman mentioned an upcoming vacation. Another began discussing resorts in Florida. To my surprise, Brandon joined the conversation enthusiastically. He started describing a luxury beach property he and Heather had visited recently. I stood nearby listening. My stomach slowly tightened. Luxury beach property resort recommendations. This wasn't the language of a family struggling to survive. This was the language of people who had disposable income, or at least wanted others to think they did. When Brandon noticed me nearby, his expression changed immediately. The conversation ended. The subject shifted. The moment felt strange, almost guilty. That night, I opened Facebook again. For the first time, I intentionally searched through Brandon and Heather's profiles. What I found surprised me. Not because there was one shocking discovery, because there were dozens of smaller ones. Weekend trips, concerts, restaurants, sporting events, shopping outings. None of it screamed wealth. But neither did it scream hardship. In fact, many of those activities cost far more than the things I spent money on myself. I felt a painful realization forming. Whenever Brandon needed help, he presented himself as overwhelmed and desperate. Yet, outside those conversations, he appeared to be living quite comfortably. For years, I had never compared the two versions. Now I couldn't stop. One version asked for financial rescue. The other version posted vacation photos. Which one was real? The following weekend, I visited Patricia. We sat on her back porch drinking lemonade. The weather was warm. Birds chirped in the distance. Normally, I enjoyed our afternoons together. This time, I felt restless. I told her everything I had noticed, every contradiction, every inconsistency. When I finished, Patricia remained silent for several moments. Then she asked another difficult question. What if the problem isn't that Brandon has no money? I looked at her. What do you mean? What if the problem is that Brandon expects you to cover the consequences of his choices? The statement hit me hard, because it felt possible, painfully possible. Not because Brandon was poor, because Brandon spent beyond his means. And whenever reality caught up with him, I softened the landing. I remembered every transfer, every check, every emergency. Suddenly, a troubling pattern emerged. Perhaps I hadn't been helping him solve problems. Perhaps I had been helping him avoid responsibility. The thought made me feel sick. No mother wants to believe that. No mother wants to believe her kindness has become part of the problem. Yet I couldn't dismiss it. Not anymore. Over the next several days, I found myself looking more carefully, listening more carefully, paying attention in ways I never had before, and the more attention I paid, the more questions appeared. Questions about where the money had gone, questions about what was true, questions about how much I actually knew about my son's finances. For the first time in years, I felt something stronger than guilt, stronger than obligation, stronger than fear. I felt suspicion, and once suspicion enters a relationship, it changes everything. Because whether the answers confirmed my fears or disproved them, I knew one thing with certainty. I could no longer keep pretending not to see what was right in front of me. Suspicion is a strange thing. Once it enters your mind, it quietly changes the way you see everything. For years, I had automatically believed every explanation Brandon gave me. Now, for the first time, I found myself questioning them. I hated it. I hated feeling suspicious of my own son. I hated wondering whether I had been manipulated. Most of all, I hated the possibility that Patricia had been right all along. For several days, I tried to ignore my concerns. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself social media never shows the full story. I told myself there were reasonable explanations for everything. But the questions refused to disappear. Eventually, I decided I needed facts, not assumptions. Facts. One rainy afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, my laptop, and several years of bank statements. At first, I only intended to review a few transactions. Instead, I spent nearly 6 hours going through records. Transfer after transfer, check after check, withdrawal after withdrawal. Some of the amounts immediately stood out. Others I had completely forgotten. As I worked, I began creating a list. Credit card debt, vehicle repairs, medical expenses, home repairs, business emergencies, tax issues, school expenses, unexpected bills. The list kept growing, and growing, and growing. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking. Not because of a single payment, because of the total. I grabbed a calculator, checked the numbers twice. Then a third time. The final amount made my stomach drop. Over the years, I had given Brandon tens of thousands of dollars. Far more than I had realized. Far more than I would have guessed. I sat in stunned silence. For several minutes, I simply stared at the number. That money represented years of work, years of saving, years of sacrifice. Robert and I had spent decades building financial security, and little by little, Huge portions of it had flowed directly to Brandon. The realization felt overwhelming, but what hurt even more was something else. As I reviewed the dates, patterns began emerging. Certain emergencies didn't seem to line up. Certain stories suddenly looked suspicious. One example immediately caught my attention. Several years earlier, Brandon had called in a panic about a supposedly catastrophic business problem. According to him, a major contract had fallen through. Without immediate financial help, he claimed the company might collapse. I remembered how terrified he sounded. I remembered wiring money the very next day. Yet while reviewing the dates, I noticed something strange. The transfer occurred during the exact same week Brandon had posted photos from a luxury lakeside vacation. I opened Facebook, scrolled backward, found the pictures. There they were. The dates matched perfectly. While he had supposedly been facing financial disaster, he had been renting a cabin and spending a weekend boating with friends. I felt sick. Maybe the trip had already been paid for. Maybe there was an explanation, but the coincidence bothered me a lot. I kept digging. The next discovery hurt even more. Several years earlier, Brandon had asked for money to cover emergency repairs on his home. He described major plumbing damage, water problems, urgent expenses. I remembered worryings about him for weeks, but while reviewing old emails, I found something odd. A message from Heather. The date matched the same period. In the email, she excitedly mentioned remodeling part of their house. Remodeling. Not repairing. Remodeling. Those two words are not the same. Not even close. My chest tightened. The further I looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Not outright proof, but enough to create serious doubt. That evening, I called Patricia. She came over within an hour. I spread the paperwork across the kitchen table. Neither of us spoke at first. Patricia quietly reviewed the numbers. When she finally looked up, her expression was heartbreaking. Not angry, not surprised, sad, very sad. Oh, Gloria. I swallowed hard. I didn't know. I know. I honestly didn't know. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You trusted your son. The kindness in her voice nearly made me cry, because that was exactly what hurt most. Trust. Trust had always been the foundation of our relationship. Now that foundation felt cracked, maybe even broken. A few days later, something happened that pushed me even further. Completely by accident. I ran into an old acquaintance at a grocery store. His name was Mark. Years ago, he had worked with Brandon on several projects. We chatted casually for a few minutes. Then he mentioned something unexpected. I saw Brandon last month. I smiled politely. Really? Yeah, funny guy. I nodded. Mark laughed. I still remember that expensive resort trip he organized a few years back. My smile froze. Resort trip, yeah. He named the location. A high-end destination. Definitely not cheap. Then he mentioned the year. My stomach dropped, because I recognized it immediately. It was the exact same year Brandon had called me crying about financial hardship. The exact same year I had transferred thousands of dollars to help him. Mark continued talking, completely unaware of my reaction. Apparently, Brandon had covered a significant portion of the trip expenses. Several people had even joked about how successful his business seemed. I barely heard the rest. My heart pounded in my chest. When I returned home, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, trying to process everything. For years, whenever Brandon described a crisis, I assumed survival was the priority. Now, I was beginning to realize something much worse. Many of those crises may not have been about survival at all. They may have been about maintaining a lifestyle beyond his means. And every time reality threatened that lifestyle, I stepped in. Like a safety net, like an insurance policy, like an ATM. The word hurt, but I couldn't stop thinking it. That night, I barely slept. Memories kept replaying in my mind. Every emotional phone call, every desperate request, every promise to repay me, every assurance that things would improve soon. Had any of it been true, or had I simply believed what I wanted to believe? Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked into the kitchen. The house was completely silent. I stood there staring at an old photograph of Robert. For years, whenever I faced difficult decisions, I imagined what he would say. That night, the answer felt surprisingly clear. Robert would want the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter who it hurt. And for the first time, I realized something else. I wasn't angry because of the money. Not really. Money can be replaced. Savings can be rebuilt. What devastated me was the possibility that my son had knowingly taken advantage of my love, that he had looked into the eyes of the woman who raised him and seen an opportunity instead of a mother. Tears filled my eyes, because that possibility was almost unbearable. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I was done guessing, done wondering, done making excuses. I needed answers, real answers, not stories, not emotional appeals, not promises, facts, and there was only one person who could provide them. Brandon. For years, I had avoided confrontation because I was afraid of damaging our relationship. Now, I understood something important. The relationship was already damaged. The only question remaining was whether the truth could still save it. And I was finally ready to find out. For 3 days, I rehearsed the conversation in my head. Every version ended differently. In some, Brandon apologized immediately. In others, he explained everything and proved I had misunderstood. In my darkest imaginings, he became angry and defensive. I desperately hoped those versions were wrong. No mother wants to prepare for a confrontation with her child, especially when that child is 42 years old and should know better. But after everything I had discovered, I could no longer pretend. I called Brandon on Friday morning. "We need to talk." My tone must have sounded unusual because he immediately asked, "Is something wrong?" "Yes." A long silence followed. Then he agreed to meet. The following afternoon, I drove to his house carrying a folder. Inside were years of bank statements, note dates, and records. I hated how official it looked, like evidence, like something prepared for a courtroom rather than a conversation between a mother and her son. As I walked to the front door, my heart pounded. Part of me still hoped there was an explanation, a misunderstanding, anything. Brandon greeted me with a cautious smile. Heather was home too. The moment she saw the folder in my hands, her expression changed. We sat around the dining room table. Nobody spoke at first. The silence felt suffocating. Finally, I took a deep breath. "I need answers." Brandon frowned. "Answers about what?" I opened the folder. "About the money." His face immediately hardened. Not guilty, not embarrassed, annoyed. That reaction alone hurt. For years, I had helped him without question. Now, when I finally asked questions, he seemed irritated. I pulled out the first page. "Do you remember telling me your business was on the verge of collapse?" "Which time?" The answer shocked me. Which time, as though there had been so many emergencies he couldn't keep track. I pointed to a date. Brandon glanced down. "Yeah." I slid another page across the table. "A week later, you were at a lakeside resort." His eyes narrowed. "So?" I stared at him. "So? Mom people can still take vacations." I felt disbelief spreading through me. I'm talking about priorities." He shrugged. "It was already planned. No apology, no explanation, no concern, just dismissal." I moved to the next example. The home repair emergency, the remodeling project. the medical expenses, the business crisis. One by one, I presented the inconsistencies. One by one, Brandon found explanations. Some sounded plausible, others sounded ridiculous. But something became increasingly clear. He wasn't trying to understand why I felt hurt. He was trying to defend himself. Eventually, frustration overcame me. "Brandon, please stop." The room fell silent. I took a deep breath. "Do you understand what this looks like?" His jaw tightened. "I understand that you're keeping score." The words hit me like a slap. Keeping score. As though my concern was the problem. Not the years of financial support, not the possible dishonesty. My concern. I stared at him in disbelief. "You think that's what this is? Oh, what else would it be?" I felt my chest tighten. "What it is," I said quietly, "is a mother trying to understand why she feels used." For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, anger. "Used? Yes." "That's ridiculous." I shook my head slowly. "Is it?" Brandon leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Parents are supposed to help their children." The room became very still. I looked at him, really looked at him, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't about emergencies. This wasn't about temporary hardship. This was about entitlement, pure entitlement. He genuinely believed my financial support was something he deserved, something owed to him. I spoke carefully. "Helping occasionally is one thing." "Exactly." "No," I interrupted him. "What we've been doing is something else." His expression darkened. Heather finally spoke. "Brandon isn't saying he deserves your money." I turned toward her. "Then why was everyone upset when I booked my vacation?" Neither of them answered. That silence told me more than words could. Because there was no good answer. If they truly believed the money belonged to me, the vacation shouldn't have been a problem. The problem existed because they had already mentally spent it. I continued. "For years, every time there was a problem, I stepped in." "Because you wanted to." Brandon's response came instantly. I stared at him. The statement was technically true, which made it even more painful. Yes, I had wanted to help. But wanting to help isn't the same as wanting to be exploited. I lowered my voice. "Did you ever intend to pay me back?" Brandon looked away. For just a second, but I saw it. That tiny hesitation, that tiny moment. Then he answered. "Things were complicated." I laughed, not because anything was funny, because I suddenly realized there had never been a plan. Not really. The promises had simply been part of the process. Something comforting to say. Something that made it easier for me to hand over the money. I closed the folder. The conversation had already given me the answer I needed. Not because Brandon admitted anything, because of what he didn't admit. No apology, no gratitude, no acknowledgement. Only justification, defense, entitlement. The realization broke something inside me. Not my love for my son. That remained, but the illusion I had protected for years. The illusion that he viewed my sacrifices the same way I did. He didn't. To him, they were expected, normal, automatic, a resource. Nothing more. After a long silence, I stood. "I'm leaving." Brandon frowned. "You're seriously upset about this?" The question stunned me. After everything we'd discussed, he still didn't understand. Or perhaps he refused to. I picked up the folder. At the doorway, I turned back. "Do you know what hurts most?" Nobody answered. "It's not the money." Their faces remained blank. "It's realizing that somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing my help as a gift." I swallowed hard. "You started seeing it as an obligation." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I walked out. The drive home was one of the loneliest experiences of my life. I cried several times. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears. The kind that come from disappointment. The kind that come when a painful truth finally becomes impossible to deny. When I arrived home, Patricia was waiting. I had texted her earlier. The moment she saw my face, she knew. I sat beside her on the couch. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she asked, "How bad was it?" I stared at the floor. Then I answered with complete honesty. Worse than I imagined. Because I had entered that conversation hoping to uncover lies. Instead, I uncovered something far more painful. A belief. A belief that my sacrifices belonged to Brandon by default. And once someone starts believing they're entitled to your generosity, they rarely appreciate it. They simply expect more. For the first time in years, I understood something clearly. Nothing would change unless I changed it. And that realization was both terrifying and freeing. Because whether Brandon liked it or not, the rules of our relationship were about to change. For several days after my confrontation with Brandon, I barely spoke to anyone. I went through the motions of daily life. I watered my garden. I attended church. I volunteered at the library. But emotionally, I felt exhausted. The conversation had confirmed everything I feared. Yet instead of feeling relieved, I felt heartbroken. A mother spends a lifetime protecting her child. It's difficult to accept that the person you're protecting may not appreciate the sacrifices you've made. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was the emotional distance. The realization that Brandon and I seemed to be living in completely different versions of reality. In my version, I had spent years helping him. In his version, I had simply done what I was supposed to do. That difference haunted me. One afternoon, about a week after our confrontation, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I wasn't expecting visitors. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Madison standing there, alone. She looked nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen her. "Madison?" She forced a small smile. "Hi, Grandma. Is everything okay?" She nodded quickly. "Can I come in?" Something in her voice immediately concerned me. I stepped aside. "Of course." We sat at the kitchen table. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Madison stared at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. I waited patiently. Eventually, she looked up. "I'm sorry." The words caught me completely off guard. "What? I'm sorry?" Her eyes filled with tears. I felt my chest tighten. "Sweetheart, what are you talking about?" She swallowed hard. Then she said something that shattered my heart. "I'm sorry for how Mom and Dad treated you." The room became silent. I stared at her, unable to speak. Madison wiped her eyes. "I heard some of the arguments." I looked down at the table. Part of me wanted to protect her from adult problems. Another part realized she already knew more than I thought. She continued quietly. "They were wrong." Hearing those words from a 16-year-old girl nearly made me cry, because it was the first time anyone in the family had acknowledged my feelings. The first time. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You don't need to apologize for them." "I know." Her voice cracked. "But someone should." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Madison took a deep breath. "I wanted to tell you something." Immediately, I sensed this was important, very important. "What is it?" She hesitated. Then she began talking. Slowly at first, carefully choosing her words. What she told me changed everything, not because it revealed some shocking secret, because it confirmed something much worse, a pattern. According to Madison, conversations about my money happened far more often than I realized. Far more often. Sometimes when bills arrived, sometimes when vacations were discussed, sometimes when expensive purchases came up. My name would enter the conversation. Grandma can help. Grandma will understand. Grandma always helps. The words hit me harder than I expected, because they sounded so casual, so automatic, as though my financial support had become part of their planning process, not an emergency solution, a strategy. Madison looked miserable as she spoke. I always felt weird about it. I frowned. Weird? She nodded. Because nobody ever talked about paying you back. That sentence landed heavily. Nobody ever talked about paying you back. Not once. Not even privately. Madison continued. Whenever money was tight, they acted like you would take care of it. I felt a painful ache in my chest. Not because of the money, because of the expectation, the entitlement, the assumption. Years earlier, I had helped out of love. Somewhere along the way, that love had apparently become predictable, reliable, expected. Madison wiped away another tear. I didn't know how to tell you. I moved around the table and wrapped my arms around her. For several moments, we simply sat there, grandmother and granddaughter, holding each other, trying to process a painful truth. Eventually, she spoke again. There were times when things weren't as bad as they said. I looked at her. What do you mean? She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Then she answered, Sometimes they exaggerated. My stomach tightened. I already suspected that. Yet hearing it from Madison somehow made it more real, more painful. She quickly added, I don't think they saw it that way. I remained silent. Madison thought for a moment. Then she said something remarkably mature. I think they got used to it. The simplicity of her observation stunned me. Because she was probably right, used to it, not necessarily evil, not necessarily malicious, just accustomed to having a safety net named Gloria Pierce, a safety net that always appeared whenever things became difficult. For years, I had viewed my help as generosity. Perhaps Brandon had eventually viewed it as certainty, as something permanent, something guaranteed. Madison continued talking. She admitted that many arguments occurred behind closed doors. Arguments about spending, arguments about debt, arguments about money management. Apparently, Heather frequently worried about finances. Brandon often reassured her, sometimes by saying business would improve, other times by mentioning me. That realization hurt, not because Brandon trusted me, because he relied on me. There is a difference, a significant difference. As the conversation continued, another truth emerged. Madison wasn't visiting to provide information. Not really. She was visiting because she felt guilty, because she loved me, because she hated watching someone take advantage of my kindness. Even if that someone was her father, that realization brought tears to my eyes. I reached for her hand. You have nothing to feel guilty about. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. We spent the next hour talking, really talking, about family, about responsibility, about mistakes, about forgiveness. By the end of the conversation, something unexpected had happened. I felt lighter, not because the situation had improved, because I finally understood that not everyone in the family saw me as a source of money. Madison saw me as a person, as a grandmother, as someone worthy of respect. That mattered more than she could possibly know. Before leaving, she stood at the front door and looked at me nervously. Then she asked, Are you still going on your trip? The question surprised me. I smiled softly. I think so. Her face brightened immediately. Good. I laughed. Good. Yes. She nodded firmly. You deserve it. Those 3 words nearly broke me. Because after months of criticism, guilt, and pressure, hearing someone say I deserved happiness felt extraordinary. After she left, I sat alone in my living room thinking about everything she had shared. The conversation didn't erase the pain. It didn't repair my relationship with Brandon. It didn't solve any problems, but it gave me something important: clarity. For the first time, I understood that saying no wouldn't destroy my family. The unhealthy patterns were what threatened the family, not boundaries, not self-respect, not one vacation. And as I sat there remembering Madison's words, I realized something else. For years, I had been afraid of disappointing Brandon. Maybe it was finally time for Brandon to experience disappointment. Because if he never did, he would never learn. And if I never changed, neither would he. After Madison's visit, I made a decision. Not an emotional decision, not an angry decision, a permanent decision. I was done being my son's financial safety net. The realization didn't arrive with dramatic music or some grand moment of empowerment. It arrived quietly, calmly, like a door closing. For years, every financial problem in Brandon's life had eventually become my responsibility. Now it wouldn't. That didn't mean I stopped loving him. It didn't mean I wanted him to suffer. It simply meant I was finally allowing him to face consequences that belonged to him. And that terrified me. The following Monday morning, I received a phone call from Brandon. The timing almost made me laugh. It felt inevitable. As soon as I answered, I could hear tension in his voice. "Mom, are you busy?" "No." He hesitated. Then came the familiar pattern. A business issue, delayed payments, temporary cash flow problems. Just a short-term situation. As he spoke, I realized something surprising. For the first time in years, I wasn't emotionally hooked by the story. Normally, my heart would race. My anxiety would activate immediately. I'd start searching for solutions before he finished talking. This time, I simply listened. When he finally stopped speaking, silence filled the line. Then I said something I had never said before. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that." Another pause, then, "So can you help?" I took a deep breath. "No." The word felt strange, foreign, powerful. The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, Brandon spoke. "What?" "No." I repeated it calmly. "I can't help this time." Technically, that wasn't true. I could help. I had the money. What I meant was something different. I wasn't going to help. Brandon sounded stunned. "Mom, it's temporary." "I understand. It's not a huge amount." "I understand." "Then why are you saying no?" I stared out the kitchen window. The answer felt obvious. Because I'm not responsible for solving every problem in your life. But I knew he wouldn't hear that. Not yet. So I kept my response simple. I've made other commitments. The other commitment was myself, my trip, my future, my life. Brandon's frustration became obvious. "We're talking about family." "So am I." The conversation ended badly. Again. But something was different this time. After hanging up, I didn't feel guilty. Not the overwhelming guilt that usually consumed me. Instead, I felt sad. Very sad. Because I realized Brandon genuinely believed he was the victim. He couldn't see the years of support. He only saw the first refusal. That perspective made meaningful communication almost impossible. A few days later, Heather called. That rarely happened. Usually, Brandon handled financial conversations. The moment I saw her name on my phone, I knew what was coming. Her voice sounded polite, almost overly polite. We exchanged small talk for several minutes. Then she gradually moved toward the real topic. College expenses, bills, stress, uncertainty. Eventually, she said it. "We really hoped you'd reconsider." I remained silent. Heather sighed. "Madison's future is important." The statement irritated me more than it should have, because it implied I didn't care about Madison. Nothing could be further from the truth. "I love Madison." "I know." "Then don't use her to make me feel guilty." The silence that followed was immediate. Heather clearly wasn't expecting that response. Neither was I. For years, I would have apologized, backtracked, softened my words. This time, I didn't, because they were true. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Not angrily, just awkwardly, as though both of us suddenly realized the old dynamics no longer worked. Over the following weeks, the pressure increased. Family gatherings became uncomfortable. Brandon grew distant. Heather became colder. Text messages became less frequent. Phone calls almost disappeared. Part of me worried. Another part recognized what was happening. The relationship was adjusting, painfully, messily, but necessarily. One Saturday afternoon, Patricia came over. We sat on the patio drinking iced tea. The weather was beautiful. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Not completely happy, but peaceful. Patricia studied me carefully. "You seem different," I laughed. "Apparently, everyone thinks that." "No," she smiled. "This is different in a good way." I looked out at the garden. Maybe she was right. I still felt grief. I still felt disappointment. But underneath those emotions, something new was growing. Self-respect. For years, I had confused love with sacrifice. The more I gave, the more loving I believed myself to be. Now, I was learning something important. Love, without boundaries, eventually becomes unhealthy for everyone involved. A few days later, I received another surprise. Madison called, just to talk, not to ask for anything, not to relay messages, simply to talk. We spent nearly an hour discussing school friends and college applications. At one point, she asked about my trip. I told her about the itinerary: Paris, Rome, Venice. Her excitement was contagious. "You have to send pictures." I smiled. "I will." "You've never done anything like this before, have you?" "No." "Then it's about time." I laughed. The conversation lifted my spirits more than she probably realized, because it reminded me that healthy relationships don't revolve around transactions. They revolve around connection, respect, care. After we hung up, I began finalizing travel arrangements: flights, hotels, excursions. The closer the departure date came, the more real everything felt. So did the resistance from Brandon. One evening, he sent a text message. Short, cold. "I still think you're making a mistake." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I put the phone down without replying, because there was nothing left to say. He viewed my decision as selfish. I viewed it as necessary. Neither of us was going to convince the other. At least not right now. As the weeks passed, I noticed something else. Without constant financial support, Brandon seemed increasingly stressed. Not desperate, not ruined, stressed. Which raised an uncomfortable question. If one refusal created this much pressure, how dependent had he become on my money? The answer worried me, because dependence creates vulnerability, and vulnerability often creates resentment, especially when the support disappears. One evening, while reviewing my travel documents, I found myself thinking about Robert. I imagined telling him everything: the arguments, the guilt, the accusations, the boundaries. Then I imagined his response. Not the exact words, just the feeling: pride. Not because I was traveling, because I was finally standing up for myself. That thought brought an unexpected comfort. For years, I had honored Robert by taking care of everyone else. Maybe now I could honor him by taking care of myself too. As my departure date approached, I sensed that bigger consequences were coming. Brandon wasn't adjusting well. The financial pressure around him was increasing. The resentment was growing. And for the first time in many years, there would be nobody rushing in to rescue him. Part of me feared what might happen next. Another part knew it was long overdue. Because sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step back and allow an adult child to face reality, even when that reality hurts. The consequences started slowly. Then they arrived all at once. For several weeks after I stopped providing financial support, I heard very little from Brandon. At first, the silence felt almost peaceful. No emergency phone calls. No guilt-filled conversations. No carefully disguised requests for money. Just quiet. Part of me hoped that maybe he was figuring things out. Maybe he was adjusting. Maybe he was finally learning to manage his own responsibilities. Then reality caught up with him, and everything began to unravel. The first sign came from Madison. She called me one evening after school. Her voice sounded worried, not panicked, worried. "Grandma." "Hi, sweetheart. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." There was a brief pause. Then she asked, "Have Mom and Dad talked to you recently?" Immediately I knew something was wrong. "No." Another pause. Then she sighed. "They've been arguing a lot." I closed my eyes. The words didn't surprise me, but they still hurt. "About money." "Mostly." I thanked her for telling me and gently changed the subject. I didn't want her carrying adult burdens. Yet after we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because deep down, I understood what was happening. For years, whenever Brandon and Heather made financial mistakes, I absorbed part of the impact. Now, the impact was landing where it belonged. On them. A week later, Patricia called. She had run into someone who knew Brandon professionally. Apparently, his business wasn't failing. Not exactly. The real problem was spending. Too much spending. Too many unnecessary expenses. Too many financial commitments. Too many attempts to maintain a lifestyle that exceeded reality. That information aligned perfectly with everything I had already discovered. The issue wasn't income. The issue was discipline. And discipline can't be borrowed from someone else's bank account. Soon after that, I received a text from Brandon. Not a request, not an apology, just a short message. "Things are difficult right now." I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond immediately. Part of me wanted to ask what was wrong. Part of me wanted to fix everything. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care. Because I knew where the conversation would lead. And I wasn't willing to return to old patterns. 3 days later, Heather called. This time, she sounded very different. Gone was the confident tone. Gone was the subtle guilt. She sounded exhausted. After several minutes of small talk, she finally admitted the truth. Their credit card balances had become a serious problem. Several payments were overdue. They had begun cutting back on expenses. There were disagreements about spending priorities. Business revenue wasn't keeping up with their lifestyle. As she talked, I felt a mixture of emotions: sympathy, sadness, frustration, validation. Because none of this surprised me anymore. The signs had been there for years. Everyone had simply ignored them. Especially Brandon. At one point, Heather became emotional. "I don't know how we got here." The answer immediately came to mind. Because nobody ever had to face consequences. But I didn't say that. Instead, I listened. When the conversation ended, she never directly asked for money. That alone told me how serious the situation had become. The old strategies were no longer working. A few days later, I learned something else. The new SUV was gone. At first, I assumed it was being serviced. Then Madison casually mentioned that her parents had traded it for a cheaper vehicle. I nearly dropped my coffee. A cheaper vehicle. That was new. For years, every problem had been solved through outside help. Now, for the first time, sacrifices were being made. Real sacrifices. The kind ordinary people make every day. The kind Robert and I had made throughout our entire marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brandon had spent years criticizing the cautious lifestyle that built my financial security. Now he was being forced to adopt it. One evening, Madison came over for dinner. As we ate, she quietly shared more updates. Nothing dramatic, just small observations. Her parents were canceling subscriptions, cutting expenses, avoiding restaurants, postponing purchases. The changes sounded ordinary, necessary, responsible, yet apparently they felt shocking inside Brandon's household. That realization saddened me, because it revealed how disconnected he had become from financial reality. After dinner, Madison helped me wash dishes. As we stood at the sink, she suddenly asked, "Do you think Dad is angry at you?" I considered the question carefully. Then I answered honestly, "Yes." She looked down. "But you're not wrong." I smiled sadly. "Sometimes people can be angry and still be wrong." She nodded thoughtfully. The conversation stayed with me long after she left, because I realized something important. Brandon wasn't really angry about the vacation. He was angry about losing access. Access to money, access to security, access to a solution he had relied upon for years. Without that access, reality felt much harsher. Several weeks later, I experienced another surprising moment. I was grocery shopping when I ran into Brandon unexpectedly. The encounter felt awkward immediately. Neither of us knew how to behave. For years, our relationship had followed familiar patterns. Now those patterns were broken. We exchanged polite greetings, discussed the weather, talked briefly about Madison. Then silence arrived. Eventually, Brandon spoke. "We've had to make some adjustments." I looked at him. His expression was tired, older somehow, more worn down than I remembered. Part of me felt compassion. Another part recognized something important. For the first time, he was experiencing the consequences of his own decisions, not mine, his. "I know things have been difficult," I said softly. He nodded. The conversation could have become a request, a complaint, an argument. Instead, something unexpected happened. He simply sighed, a long, exhausted sigh. Then he said, "I didn't realize how much money we were wasting." The admission caught me off guard, not because it was a full apology. It wasn't. But it was the first moment of genuine self-awareness I had heard from him in years. A tiny crack in the wall. Nothing more. Yet enough to give me hope. After we parted ways, I sat in my car, thinking about that conversation. Perhaps reality was finally teaching lessons that I never could. Lessons about responsibility, consequences, financial discipline, the cost of entitlement. Those lessons are painful. But sometimes pain is an effective teacher. As my departure date for Europe approached, I found myself feeling unexpectedly calm. Not because everything had been resolved. Because it hadn't. The family still carried tension. Relationships were still strained. Trust was still damaged. But beneath all of that, something important was happening. The old system was collapsing. The unhealthy system. The one built on guilt dependency and avoidance. And although collapse is uncomfortable sometimes, it's necessary before something healthier can be built. I didn't know whether Brandon would learn from this experience. I didn't know whether our relationship would recover. But for the first time in a very long time, I knew one thing with certainty. I was no longer responsible for saving my son from the consequences of his choices. And that realization felt like freedom. The morning of my departure arrived faster than I expected. For months, the trip had existed only as an idea, a dream, a symbol of independence. Now it was real, very real. I stood in my kitchen before sunrise, sipping coffee and staring at my suitcase. For a moment, I felt nervous. Not about flying, not about Europe, about leaving. For most of my life, I had structured every decision around other people. Even now, a small voice inside me wondered whether I should postpone everything. Wait a little longer. Stay available. Just in case. Then I smiled. That voice had controlled me long enough. I picked up my suitcase, locked the front door, and left. At the airport, Patricia hugged me so hard, I almost lost my balance. "You finally did it," I laughed. "I finally did it." Neither of us mentioned Brandon. Neither of us needed to. This trip wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. Several hours later, I was sitting on a plane, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. As the clouds drifted beneath us, I found myself thinking about Robert. Not with sadness, with gratitude. Because despite everything life had thrown at us, he had always encouraged me to dream. In many ways, I felt as though I was carrying a piece of him with me. The moment I arrived in Paris, I understood why people fall in love with the city. The architecture, the cafes, the sounds, the energy. Everything felt different from home, and for the first time in years, I felt different too. Lighter. I spent my first afternoon walking through narrow streets lined with shops and restaurants. No schedules, no obligations, no emergencies, no phone calls asking for money. Just freedom. Pure freedom. That evening, I sat at an outdoor cafe watching the sunset. The city glowed with warm, golden light. As I sipped coffee, I realized something. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt completely present. For years, part of my mind was always somewhere else. Worrying, planning, solving problems. Now, for the first time, my attention belonged entirely to the moment. The following day, I visited the Eiffel Tower. The experience hit me harder than I expected. As I stood beneath the massive structure, memories flooded my mind. Robert, sitting beside me on our couch decades earlier. Robert pointing at the television. Robert promising that one day we would come here together. Tears filled my eyes. Not because I was lonely, because I felt connected to him. For years, I believed that dream died when he did. Now I understood something different. Dreams don't always disappear. Sometimes they simply wait. That evening, I sent a photograph to Patricia. Her response arrived immediately. Robert would be proud. I smiled, because I believed that too. Over the next several days, I explored Paris. Museums, historic churches, beautiful gardens, small bakeries tucked into quiet streets. Every experience felt precious. Not because it was luxurious, because it was mine. Something I had chosen for myself. Something nobody could take away. Meanwhile, life continued back home. Occasionally, Madison sent me text messages, simple updates, nothing dramatic. But between the lines, I sensed things were still difficult. Brandon was working longer hours. Financial stress remained high. Arguments still happened. Yet something else seemed to be changing. Accountability. Apparently, Brandon had started reviewing household expenses more carefully. Budgeting, planning, cutting unnecessary spending. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was finally doing the things Robert and I had done our entire lives. After Paris, I traveled to Rome. If Paris felt elegant, Rome felt eternal. Everywhere I looked, history surrounded me. Ancient ruins, stone streets, buildings older than my entire country. One afternoon, I sat near the Colosseum, watching tourists pass by. As I looked around, I noticed something surprising. Many of the people around me were older. Some much older. 70s, 80s. Still exploring. Still learning. Still living. For years, I had unconsciously accepted a dangerous idea. That life gradually becomes smaller as you age. Rome taught me otherwise. Life only becomes smaller if you allow it to. That realization stayed with me, especially at night when I returned to my hotel room. Back home, my world had slowly shrunk. Without realizing it, I had reduced my identity to one role. Mother. Everything else faded into the background. This trip was helping me remember that Gloria Pierce existed beyond motherhood, beyond sacrifice, beyond obligation, and that discovery felt transformative. Several days later, I arrived in Venice, Of all 3 cities, Venice surprised me the most. There was something magical about it. The canals, the bridges, the winding pathways, the sense of stepping into another world. One evening, while taking a boat ride through the city, I found myself sitting beside another American woman. She was around my age, a widow, traveling alone. We spent nearly an hour talking. Eventually, she asked why I decided to take the trip. I hesitated, then I told her the truth. Not every detail, just enough. My son, the guilt, the years of putting everyone else first. She listened carefully, then she smiled. You know what I think? What? I think this trip saved you. The statement surprised me. Yet the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Because the journey wasn't really about Europe. Europe was simply the setting. The real journey was internal. I was learning who I was without everyone else's expectations, without everyone else's demands, without everyone else's needs. And I liked the person I was discovering. One afternoon in Venice, I received a message from Madison. It contained only a few words. Grandma, I'm proud of you. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I cried. Not because I was sad, because those words meant everything. For months, I had been called selfish, criticized, judged, questioned. Yet here was the person whose future everyone claimed to be protecting. And she wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. She was proud. That message became one of my favorite souvenirs from the entire trip. By the time my journey neared its end, I felt like a different person. Not a completely different person, just a stronger version of myself. A healthier version. A version that understood something important. Love should enrich your life, not consume it. Support should empower people, not enable them. And kindness without boundaries eventually becomes self-destruction. As my flight home approached, I felt grateful. For Paris, for Rome, for Venice, for Patricia, for Madison, even for the painful lessons involving Brandon. Because all of it had led me here, to a place of clarity. What I didn't know yet was that while I had been discovering myself overseas, Brandon had been confronting realities of his own. Realities that were finally forcing him to look inward. And when I returned home, I would discover just how much had changed during my absence. I returned home on a cool autumn afternoon. As the plane descended into Columbus, I looked out the window and felt something unexpected. Peace. Not excitement, not anxiety. Peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't returning home, carrying everyone else's problems on my shoulders. I wasn't rushing back to solve a crisis. I wasn't preparing for another emotional phone call. I was simply coming home. And that felt wonderful. Patricia picked me up from the airport. The moment I climbed into her car, she hugged me tightly. You look different. I laughed. Everybody keeps saying that. Because it's true. As we drove through the familiar streets of Columbus, she asked about Paris, Rome, and Venice. I told her everything. The food, the people, the memories, the lessons. For nearly an hour, we talked nonstop. Then her expression changed slightly. There are some things you should know. I immediately understood what she meant. Brandon. I took a deep breath. How bad is it? Patricia hesitated. Not bad. That surprised me. Really? She nodded. Then she said something I never expected to hear. I think he's finally starting to get it. I stared at her. What do you mean? Over the next several minutes, she explained. Apparently, Brandon's financial situation had continued deteriorating after I left. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough to force major changes. The credit card debt could no longer be ignored. The overspending could no longer be hidden. The excuses no longer worked. For the first time in years, he had been forced to confront the reality he spent so long avoiding. And according to Patricia, that reality had humbled him. A lot. I wasn't sure what to think. Part of me wanted to believe it. Another part remained cautious. Hope can be dangerous after disappointment. The following morning, I woke up in my own bed, jet-lagged, tired, happy. As I unpacked souvenirs and photographs, my phone buzzed. A text message. From Brandon. Just seeing his name triggered a complicated mix of emotions. I opened the message. "Welcome home. I hope you had a good trip." That was all. No requests, no complaints, no criticism. Just a simple message. I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "Thank you. I did." Several hours later, another message arrived. "Can we talk sometime?" My stomach tightened. Part of me wanted to say no. Not because I hated him. Because I was afraid. Afraid of being disappointed again. Afraid of hearing more excuses. More blame. More entitlement. Yet another part of me knew avoiding the conversation wouldn't help either, so I agreed. We scheduled lunch for the following weekend. The days leading up to that meeting felt strangely emotional. I found myself thinking about Brandon constantly. Not the 42-year-old man, the little boy, the child who used to run into my arms after school, the teenager who asked me for advice, the young man Robert and I worked so hard to raise. Somewhere along the way, life became complicated. Mistakes accumulated, resentments formed, patterns developed. But beneath all of that, he was still my son. And I was still his mother. The question was whether we could find our way back to each other. Saturday finally arrived. I reached the restaurant early, a small local diner, nothing fancy, somewhere neutral, somewhere familiar. When Brandon walked through the door, I immediately noticed something. He looked different. Older. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance seemed diminished. The defensiveness was gone. The entitlement appeared absent. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. We ordered lunch, made awkward small talk, discussed my trip, the weather, Madison, everything except the real issue. Eventually, Brandon set down his coffee cup. Then he looked directly at me and said something I had been waiting years to hear. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between us. Simple, direct, unexpectedly powerful. I remained silent, letting him continue. He took a deep breath, then another. "I was wrong." Again, I said nothing. Not because I was angry, because I needed to hear everything. Not interruptions, not explanations. Everything. Brandon stared at the table for several moments. Then he spoke. Slowly. Honestly. More honestly than I had heard in years. He admitted that he had become dependent on my help. He admitted that my support had gradually become something he expected rather than appreciated. He admitted that every time I solved a problem, he postponed dealing with deeper issues. Poor spending habits, poor planning, poor financial discipline. Listening to him felt surreal. For so long, every conversation had involved excuses. Now I was hearing accountability. Real accountability. Then came the statement that affected me most. "I stopped seeing your sacrifices." My throat tightened. Brandon continued, "I knew you'd helped us." He swallowed hard. But I got used to it. There it was. The same conclusion Madison had reached months earlier. Used to it. Not evil, not malicious, just accustomed. Dangerously accustomed. He looked at me. His eyes were red. "I honestly thought you were choosing a vacation over your family." I nodded slowly. "I know." "I didn't realize what I was actually asking." His voice cracked slightly. "I was asking you to keep sacrificing your life so I wouldn't have to change mine." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The restaurant noise faded into the background. The moment felt deeply personal, deeply painful. deeply important. Then Brandon surprised me again. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply apologized. Over and over. Not dramatically, not theatrically, sincerely. The difference mattered, because true apologies focus on the harm caused, not the consequences suffered. Eventually he mentioned Madison. Apparently, she had confronted him several times during my trip. She had challenged his behavior, questioned his assumptions, refused to excuse him. I wasn't surprised. Madison possessed a wisdom far beyond her years. Brandon smiled sadly. She made me see things differently. I laughed softly. She's good at that. For the first time during the conversation, we both smiled. A genuine smile. Small, but real. As lunch ended, Brandon looked at me again. I don't expect everything to be fixed. I appreciated that. Because he was right. Trust takes time. Respect takes time. Healing takes time. But for the first time in a very long time, I believed healing was possible. Not guaranteed. Possible. And sometimes possibility is enough. As we walked toward the parking lot, I found myself thinking about Robert. How proud he would have been of this moment. Not because Brandon was perfect, because he was finally growing, finally learning, finally accepting responsibility. The journey wasn't over, far from it. But at least now, we were moving in the right direction. Together. People often think forgiveness happens in a single moment. A conversation, a hug, an apology. Then everything magically returns to normal. Real life doesn't work that way. At least it didn't for me. My lunch with Brandon was important. Maybe one of the most important conversations we'd ever had. But it wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. A healthier one. A more honest one. An honesty I've learned can be uncomfortable before it becomes healing. In the weeks that followed, Brandon and I spoke more often. Not every day, not even every week, but gradually, carefully, like two people rebuilding a bridge that had nearly collapsed. The biggest difference wasn't what we talked about. It was what we didn't talk about. Money. For the first time in years, our conversations weren't centered around financial problems. No emergencies, no requests, no guilt, no pressure. We talked about ordinary things. Madison's college applications, movies, sports, family memories, life. And somewhere in those simple conversations, I began to recognize my son again. Not the entitled version, not the frustrated version, the real version, the one buried underneath years of bad habits and unhealthy expectations. That didn't mean everything was perfect. Far from it. Trust takes time to rebuild. Sometimes I still found myself wondering whether another request would appear, whether old patterns would return. But something important had changed. The boundaries were clear now. And boundaries have a way of revealing people's true intentions. Months passed. Winter arrived. One evening, Brandon called unexpectedly. His voice sounded excited. Not stressed, excited. "Mom, I have news," I smiled. "What is it?" "We paid off one of the credit cards." I leaned back in my chair, genuinely happy for him. "That's wonderful." "It took a lot of work." "I know." There was a brief silence. Then he laughed. "Turns out budgeting actually works." I laughed too. The moment felt surprisingly emotional, because it represented growth, real growth, the kind that comes from effort rather than rescue, the kind that lasts. A few weeks later, I attended Madison's high school awards ceremony. As I sat in the auditorium watching students receive recognition, I couldn't stop smiling. Madison had worked incredibly hard. She deserved every bit of success she earned. After the ceremony ended, she ran toward me and wrapped her arms around me. Then she whispered something in my ear. "You seem happier." I pulled back and smiled. "I am happier." She nodded. I can tell. That simple exchange meant more than she realized, because happiness had become unfamiliar for a long time. Not dramatic unhappiness, just quiet neglect. The kind that happens when you spend decades putting yourself last. Now things felt different. Not because life was perfect, because my life finally included me. One Saturday evening in early spring, the entire family gathered for dinner. My house, my dining room, my table. It was the first large family gathering since everything had happened. Part of me felt nervous. Old memories lingered in that room. Painful memories. The memory of being called selfish. The memory of feeling invisible. The memory of realizing how much had gone wrong. Yet as I looked around the table that evening, something felt different. Healthier. Lighter. Brandon helped carry dishes into the kitchen. Heather offered to clean up afterward. Madison spent most of dinner making everyone laugh. No one mentioned money. No one criticized my vacation. No one expected anything from me. They simply enjoyed being together. At one point, Brandon raised his glass. The room became quiet. He looked at me, then he smiled, a sincere smile. To Mom, I felt my cheeks warm. Brandon continued, "For teaching me a lesson I should have learned a long time ago." The room remained silent. I could see emotion in his eyes. "Thank you for loving me enough to stop rescuing me." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Neither could anyone else. Because everyone understood what he meant. Sometimes love looks like helping. Sometimes love looks like stepping back. The wisdom is knowing the difference. After dinner, as everyone prepared to leave, Brandon stayed behind. We stood together in the kitchen, just the two of us, the same kitchen where I had once sat crying after he called me selfish. Life has a strange sense of irony. Eventually he spoke. "I know I can't change the past." I nodded. "No. But I can do better, going forward." I smiled softly. "That's all any of us can do." Then he hugged me. Not the quick, distracted hugs we'd exchanged for years. A real hug. The kind filled with gratitude. The kind filled with understanding. And in that moment, I knew something important. I had forgiven him. Not because he was my son. Not because he apologized. Because he changed. Because he accepted responsibility. Because he did the difficult work of becoming better. Forgiveness without accountability often creates more damage. But accountability, followed by growth, that's different. That's healing. After everyone left, I sat alone on my back porch. The evening air felt cool and peaceful. The sky glowed with the last colors of sunset. I thought about everything that had happened. Robert's death. The years of financial support. The guilt. The arguments. The trip. The confrontation. The healing. Every part of the journey had taught me something valuable. The biggest lesson surprised me. I had spent most of my life believing that loving people meant sacrificing for them. Now I understood something deeper. Love without self-respect eventually becomes unhealthy for both people. True love includes boundaries. True love includes honesty. True love allows people to experience consequences and growth. Most importantly, true love does not require you to abandon yourself. At 68 years old, I finally learned that living for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And perhaps that was the greatest gift this entire experience gave me. Not a vacation, not reconciliation, not even emotional justice. The gift was freedom. The freedom to love my family without losing myself in the process. The freedom to enjoy my life without guilt. The freedom to remember that Gloria Pierce mattered too. And after spending so many years putting myself last, that freedom felt priceless. If there's one lesson I hope people take from my story, it's this: love and sacrifice are not the same thing. Many parents spend decades giving everything they have to their children. Time, energy, money, emotional support. We do it willingly because we love them, but sometimes, without realizing it, that love can slowly turn into a pattern that prevents growth. Helping someone through a difficult season is an act of kindness. Rescuing someone from every consequence of their choices is something very different. I learned that boundaries are not punishments. Boundaries are acts of self-respect. They protect relationships from becoming unhealthy. They teach people responsibility. And sometimes, they become the very thing that saves a family. I also learned that it is never too late to live your own life. Whether you're 60, 70, or 80, your dreams still matter. Your happiness still matters. Your experiences still matter. Growing older does not mean disappearing into the background of someone else's story. You are still allowed to have dreams. You are still allowed to have joy. You are still allowed to choose yourself. Most importantly, forgiveness does not mean pretending nothing happened. Real forgiveness happens when accountability, growth, and understanding come together. It doesn't erase the past, but it creates the possibility of a healthier future. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt taken for granted by someone you loved? Have you ever struggled to set boundaries with family? Share your experience in the comments because your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and join us for more emotional family stories. Before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world.